I'd like to dive in. Like you're the founder of Embodied Flow Yoga, and the word embodied gets thrown around a lot, right? And I'm curious what it means to you, and where your passion comes from to use that word as the name of your school.
Yeah. Embodied flow came about because I met the world of body mind centering, which was founded by Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. It's a lot of B's. And what Bonnie Bainbridge, in my opinion, revolutionized is the world of what she calls embodied anatomy. And so embodied anatomy, from her perspective, is moving into the anatomical landscape from the inside, not different than what you just did in that short meditation, but bringing into the foreground cellular consciousness, the felt sense of bones, the skin of the bone, the conical bone, the marrow of the bones, bringing fascia, anything, literally anything that is within us, within the body, and examining it from the felt sense of it. And so for me, that word embodied, I was borrowing from her concept of embodied anatomy. And to, for me, it means to put it within the body. And how do we use, like pairing it with the word flow, how do we use the felt sense of the music of our body in order to navigate experience versus, let's say, in the landscape of anatomy, the cognitive sense of an anatomical landscape, which in the first trainings I ever took 25 years ago, it felt like we would have a huge Netter's anatomy book and, some things to color, some things to draw, some skeletons, but the felt sense of it wasn't, besides maybe what we could touch, that wasn't in the foreground. And to me, what was revolutionary was to recognize that I'm not a brain with a body, but I'm this landscape of consciousness that also has a brain on top of other things that I have. And so for me to be embodied means to inhabit the entirety of what I am, which feels to me like a never-ending goal, because even the parts that I do inhabit within myself, the parts that I've been able to bring online, are endless in terms of what we could know. So it's I see that word has been picked up a lot, and it's a beautiful and useful word. And to me, what we intend by it in the use of embodied flow is it feels to me very specific that we're speaking of truly landing within ourselves in the body.
Mm-hmm. Right. To landing within ourselves beyond just identifying as the mind, but as the full entire.
Yeah, and one thing Bonnie Bainbridge says is the mind is everywhere. So where is the mind? I mean, we know that Buddhists say the seat of the mind is in the heart, and um, we've sort of from the age of reason perhaps given the seat of the mind to the brain. But one language that we use is, let's say, the mind of the fluids or the mind of the organs. So when
Mhm.
we land inside of a system of the body, we refer to the qualities or the felt sense of that particular part as the mind of. And it's curious because even as many years as I've been doing this, I'll still refer to the mind and point to my
Mhm.
head.
Mhm.
But where is our consciousness arising from? And one thing that Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen says is the brain is always the last to know, which I really I really love and subscribe to, because the more I enter into the topography of my body, the more I recognize that the cues of what I am or what we are arise from everywhere simultaneously. And the brain is a wonderful interpreter. However, it's an interpreter, it's not the
Mhm.
originator.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It flips the whole thing on its head a little bit, like some of the standard things that um, many of us, like the concepts we've kind of grown up with, or the simplistic ways that things are explained often.
I mean, I came from a very brain centric family. And so I think that lent itself quite a bit to my own journey, that both my parents are very smart, and they tend to examine the world from, like, I start to think of brains like a giant IEYE, and that we just we're kind of like this cyclops looking around at the world from the perspective of the brain, which the Tantra tradition would say, the mind is Maya, that the cognition of experience is what develops and creates so many stories, as you know.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It deeply resonates because I grew up in a similar environment, and it's probably one of the reasons why I embarked on the journey I did, because something was like, it's not fully it. Um and I love that piece of, oh, the brain is the last one to know, because that's like, if you consider all the information that we pick up on and don't go from an intellectual perspective, because for the ones of us that purely live in the intellect, no, the brain is the first one to know intellectual things, right? But if you open up into the full spectrum of all the things we truly pick up on, it's like, whoop, changes the
Mhm.
hierarchy. Um, I'd love to hear a little bit more of how your journey started. As you said, you came from a family that was a bit more in the intellect, and how did yoga begin for you?
Yoga began, well, I think there was two beginnings for me. The first beginning was with Lilius Forman, who was like a public TV yoga celebrity in the 70s. And, with her long braid and her unitard and her very public television, yellow rug background, as a kid, probably 7 or 8, I would pretty consistently take yoga with Lilius Forman. And then I lost it until I went to drama school in my 20s and to study directing. And I saw a friend who was practicing yoga in one of the rehearsal halls, and it sparked in such a way. She gave me a book, like a spiral notebook with stick figures doing yoga, and I practiced that in my room for about a year until I moved to Los Angeles. And then I went and I joined a gym. And in the gym, the teacher who was teaching something called, I don't know, he called it quantum yoga. He's since changed his methodology, but I immediately followed him to his yoga studio and quit the gym. And only then, this is probably 97, started twice a day yoga. Like I was obsessed. At the time, I was living in Hollywood because I was trying to be a writer director of films. And so what it mostly meant is that I was procrastinating writing and using every excuse to go to yoga whenever possible. So I thought that my vocation was writing and that yoga was my mistress, but then it's become now the reverse.
When did it tip? Or how did it tip?
um, it tipped almost immediately the second time that I mean, I was writing, but I felt like from that point of view in my 20s, when I entered into the yoga room, that time, it was it was just an obsession. It felt like everything that I had been looking for in my life. And already at that point in my 20s, like I'd gone to, school in New York. I'd done all the very arty, intellectual things in New York. I'd gone to drama school, and still I felt this bifurcation of my brain and body. But once I stepped into the first yoga class, it all came together. And that's, I mean, obviously that's the union that yoga promises, but it wasn't at that time. It didn't feel like it was so commercial, and so it wasn't this kind
Mhm.
of out front, duh, that's what yoga does. I just Los Angeles was new to me. I would say yoga was new to me, and I very quickly became obsessed with it. But it tipped into a vocation around 2001, my first day of teacher training. So I'd been taking yoga at that point like 4 years. I made an independent film. On the last day of filming that film, the whole set burnt down. And I thought it was cute at the time to call my film company Kali, Kali, like the goddess films. And that wasn't a smart idea because she is a fierce goddess. And
Mhm.
so she basically cut off my head by burning down the set. And so I thought, oh, I will get back into yoga by taking a teacher training. At that point, it was Anusara Yoga, which it was the first Anusara Yoga training in Los Angeles. And the first week of the training was 9/11. And so, really quickly, New York and the Twin Towers, which had been my backyard for 4 or 5 years, were destroyed. And for me, that was a rift in consciousness where there was no going back. Like I didn't want at the end of my days to have fought the fights that I was struggling with in filmmaking and writing and the business of Hollywood. I didn't know I would be a yoga teacher at that point. I just knew that I wasn't doing life the way I had been doing it.
Mhm.
And um, probably about 3 months later, I started my first teaching gig and never stopped. So I would say like
Mhm.
2001 was the serious.
Mhm.
this is my life
Mhm.
forever.
Mhm. Mm, super powerful, especially with 9/11 and that.
9/11 was intense. It was one of those, I mean, for me, I had started to notice a few years before that um, I would have dreams about things, either friends or loved ones, and they would they would kind of slip linear time. So sometimes I would have dreams that were very unusual, and yet somehow they would they would come true. And
Mm,
which we know now is, or what I know anyways from yoga, is like that's more common than not common, because
mhm,
we're tapping into this continuous field. But
mhm.
for sure, the morning of 9/11, and I was living in Los Angeles at the time, I was dreaming about planes hitting towers, and then woke up at like 6:30 in the morning when a friend called me to tell me to turn on the TV and watch what was
Oh
happening.
my God.
And that was for sure the dream. But the before and after rift in consciousness was so profound. There was for me no, like, there was no choice. I mean, I think many people around that time, my friends from New York certainly, and other friends of mine, ended up having a life change at that point in time, because
Yeah.
as I think is, to me, this is the next phase of that kind of radical re-rendering. The years of the pandemic feels like an echo of that time, that
Yeah.
is so significant, the before and after.
Yeah. And such a disruption that kind of, you know, for many of us opens our eyes, like, what am I doing with my life? What do I truly want to do with my life? Yeah. Yeah. You're speaking in relationship to the dreams, but in general with to the interconnectedness, and it made me want to read out, like when I ask you what you are passionate about. I absolutely love what you wrote, and I have a few questions about that, but I'd love to read for everyone to hear what you wrote. I am passionate that humans become the liberated, creative, full embodied selves that we're innately born to become, that we wake up to being a continuum in the organism of us, and in so doing, find the incentives to heal ourselves and the collective. I wish each of us to taste, to know, and to thrive so that we become mutually supportive and enjoy our multiplicity. First of all, that feels so poetic. What a beautiful,
Sounded
beautiful.
great when you read it.
um, I'd love to hear more about the waking up to being a continuum in the organism of us. What does that mean to you?
Well, I'll back up just a little bit. And, part of embodied flow is my working laboratory to understand or to realize the teachings of non-dual tantra. And in a nutshell, what that says, or what that means, is that the microcosm is the macrocosm, that we are like a drop of water in the ocean who mistakenly thinks that we're separate from the ocean. Intellectually, we could understand that, but it's a much different thing to actualize that. So, what I've noticed over years and years of practicing, let's say, embodied, it was compartmentalized, but embodied flow is trying to blur the seams of this. So, meditation, free movement, And really the self-study of inquiry that we're doing all the time is that, our skin is porous, our heart rates are linked, our in the quantum field, we know that our cells that have ever really vibrated together or resonated together can shift even if they're 10,000 miles apart measurably. And that's only with what we can measure. So the illusion that we create as human beings of being separate from one another, separate from our environment, and separate from a unified field, all of that, Buddhism says, Tantra says, is the cause of our suffering. And there's been many times, and the longer I practice and the more I journey, the more I realize more and more and more times where separateness dissolves and the knowing of being part of this field, which we all experience. I mean, the sutras will say, like in deep sleep, like in the non-dual state of deep sleep, but with our eyes open and our awareness online, or our consciousness online. And I am just simply obsessed with times when, well, what I've experienced through the laboratory of embodied flow is when the class can do that. So in that container of the class, however we get there, if it's through the skin, for example, and we're focusing on the skin, and we create a whole movement journey through moving from our skin, and then moments where maybe in the middle, maybe at the peak, maybe by the end of class, there feels to be like the resonance in the room or the flavor in the room is such that it feels that there's no separation. And we'll check in with the student. I mean, we always, in embodied flow trainings, we'll always process the class after. And so the dialogue then reveals that for most people that tends to become the experience, which I think happens a lot in music and in sports. It doesn't have to be, specific meditation per se. Like so many in so many different flow states for some people in work. And the knowing of that, and I would say the continuous remembrance of that, makes it living so rich, so wealthy, so abundant, and so endlessly fascinating, because what we're looking at outside is truly simply just a part of ourself from the perspective of Tantra. Like
Yeah.
the mantra Hamsa, I am that, is I am that. As I'm looking out at the wind and the palm trees, like, I am that. Or if I'm looking at the sunset, I am that. Or if I'm looking at a heap of garbage, I am also that. And I think the more we could say rehearse or practice that, the more we slip into that point of awareness. It's widening the field, widening our mind, which I think makes us more compelled to look at others as we would our own body, or as our own self, to have compassion, and also to use one another as a boundless resource for joy, for interaction, for inspiration. I mean, as we're doing, just to have dialogue expands already, all of the possible neural connections, all of the possible feeling connections, right? That reciprocity is how, or let's say, as the Tantra Sutras would say, as the Tantras would say, reciprocally adapted subjects and objects. So there's, if there's ears, there must be sound. Or if there's eyes, there must be form. And I guess if there's a Tara, there must be a Christina. There's somehow this amazing, like, fractal manifestation
Mhm.
that we can also identify with, just as we could identify with a single locality, like where I sit in time and space uh, and locality. I can also develop an awareness that allows me to sit in many places simultaneously, which, those moments of having a dream that is like predictive, or as many people have these super natural sensory capacities that, like clairaudience or clairvoyance. I think that's so much more common than we realize, and actually just us tapping into something that is already there.
Yeah. Yeah, and acknowledging and strengthening those parts. Like you spoke to your class and like I could feel it in my skin, right? Like I can imagine if you do a whole practice and get a palpable sense of that interconnectedness. You were speaking to remembrance, and I know for my own life, a lot of it seems to be about airtime, about just rolling up my mat or sitting down on the cushion over and over and over so that it does ripple out in my day to day. And I do notice that if I don't do that on a regular basis, it's harder to access. However, um, often, even if I did roll up my mat and I did meditate, I go into the world and zoop, I'm like in some kind of fear state, or a trauma gets triggered, and I'm convinced that I am separate, right? That what changes in the mind there, and I know that we do live in a time where there has been a lot of polarization, really, a lot of blaming and finger pointing and defensiveness. And so while I'm like, my whole body's like yes to what you're speaking, I'm also aware of a lot of what's going on in the world that seems to be an expression of the opposite, right? Of comparison and blaming and anxiety and mental health issues and all of the things that I know you and I are really passionate about. And I'm curious what, one, your take is on that, and two, what are some ongoing practices? Like, do you have any tricks for yourself when you, I don't know if you do experience that, but when you have that moment of like, no, I'm definitely separate, how,
Yeah,
how do you bring yourself back?
just the small questions. um
As we do.
yeah, I think that I think we're in a very challenging time. And, I remember at the beginning of stepping into practice, many teachers would say we're in the Kali Yuga, like this period of time where Maya is incredibly um, strong and getting stronger. And I've said to some of my friends and colleagues recently, like, oh, 20 years ago, I thought we were in Kali Yuga, but I realized like we were just ahead of the curve. Like it feels really now we're in that period of time. And it kind of reminds me of several different teachers that I met in India. And, I would sort of go to them with these wide eyes and say, like, what's the thing? Like, give me the stuff. And several times they answered to me, Sthira Sukham Asanam, like yoga is steadiness and ease. And the way that they would explicate on that is that it is not steadiness and ease in the lotus garden or at the easy times. It's steadiness and ease in the crowded marketplace. And what they meant by marketplace was not Whole Foods, but the marketplace that is the Indian marketplace with so many things happening and people begging and the smells and the chaos. Um, the other thing I would say is that whenever there's evolution, there's also devolution. It's happening simultaneously. So I think that all of the polarity that we're experiencing is an invitation for us to find how to anchor more and more inside of the diamond center of ourselves. And my practice is to find a locality in my body, mind. I use that as a hyphenate word. Um, that changes for me depending on what it is. So, part of my practices are to find locations inside of me that bring me home to the felt sense of continuity. So you mentioned like when I was speaking about the skin that gave you that sensation of skin. And that's in from body mind centering, that's called transmission. I I tried, I mean, the first part of my body that I was able to really feel and sense that wasn't obvious or tangible was my kidneys. So kidneys are a really great place for me to kind of land inside of and feel some cushion, some support. I like to find my spine, like my vertebral column. I play with the back line of my body, kind of leaning into space. I play with the sensation of my feet on the ground. I play with my heart. I'm careful though, because a lot of people say like they anchor in their heart. And sometimes my heart, at least for me, so I think it's very individual, but my heart can be one of the things that feels incredibly vulnerable or exposed, especially when there is polarity. So I try to find, I think the more places I can find in my body that help me rest into, I mean, I think of it as kind of zipping into the wider field. Um, the better it goes. So it's like gathering tools and deciding, or like having different mantras, like on the fly, which one is going to work. It's not always the same. Um,
Mhm.
and I think that's one of my main practices. If you said what's a shortcut, it's like I find, and for me, one of the most consistent places that I go is the back body, like to play. I mean, something that we use in embodied flow is the idea of axis and appendicular. And what is in functional anatomy, what is the axis of our body is the trapezoidal bone, the occiput, all the way to the sacrum. So, kind of like where a cranial sacral therapist would place two hands. And that comes from the embryology of what really is the center line of ourselves. So, if I tap into that place, the triangle shape of the sacrum and the trapezoidal shape of the occipital bone, it helps my eyes slide back and interior, helps the bones of my face and the more sort of individualized body of the mask of the face and the front body. It helps it kind of float into the support of space behind. And that helps me become less grippy on, let's say, specific words or beliefs or points of view. I'm not great at it.
Mhm.
I can easily get sparky and charged. And so I've been working a lot, like, let's say since COVID times, to hear, to listen, to see, and then just to rest back and see if I can hold the polarities of things, to keep both points of view. Because, like, what the tantra tradition would say is, from the perspective of ultimacy, it's not binary, it's not good and bad, it's not right and wrong, it's not this and that, it's isness, and it's all happening. So can you expand to the diversity of dichotomies and hold both,
Yeah.
which is a formidable practice,
Yeah.
way beyond downward dog.
Yeah. And that's where the rubber hits the road now. It's like, and
It's
that's an
endless.
ongoing practice. Yeah. Yeah. And that's where I know for myself all the suffering lies. So then when I can do the leaning out and in and back, it's like, I love the,
Yeah,
yeah.
and in identifying with, and I know this is probably part of the work that you do as well, like finding the self, capital S energy that has never not been here, that existed before we were born and continues to exist, and is also in the core of our being. And I think we all know it. It's just that so much in the world, let's say religions, governments, mostly those two, are not there to point out that you're sovereign in yourself. And so the more we take that position or take that seat within ourselves, I think the easier it becomes to remember. But as you said, it is an everyday practice, however you practice it. If you practice it in cleaning your house, or if you practice it on a yoga mat, or you practice it feeding your kids, it's a constant practice.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. And one so worthwhile. Like once we just, yeah. I know for myself, once I make that a priority, my whole nervous system, everything is, it's just more joyful, really, at the end of the day.
More
More
joyful.
connected.
And, you know, I, it may seem obvious, but to imagine a world where everyone had access to that, right? That's the thing that keeps me going, is like, okay, and I recognize, as a microcosm of the macrocosm, like, I make fun of myself all the time at how bad I am at remembering these things, but I'm probably, because it's so hard for me, that I'm compelled to pursue the practice,
Mhm.
compelled to keep working on it. I mean, I've met people who I feel like reside there innately, a lot of them native Balinese people that somehow innately reside in this very beautiful space of being part of the whole
Mhm.
so gracefully.
Yeah.
And I'm aware that maybe because it's hard for me, that therefore I'm compelled to assimilate practices or offer practices or have to practice myself.
Mhm. I mean, I don't know what your take is on that, but I feel from my own studies, it's I know for myself it has so much to do with upbringing, the culture, the family, the nervous systems we're born into, and I know because you did give the example of the Balinese, and in general, the traditions there are very, very community focused. Like children are never alone; they are held by somebody at all times. There's daily devotion, right? There is that soothing energy of sitting in prayer, in meditation, in that regulated state, right? That's a daily thing that these people are born into. And so the children, I'm noticing it of in general, there's a calmness about them. And I was in Bali during the pandemic, and the level of anxiety and nervousness was so much less than some of, I mean, we can't compare this because in different parts of the world it was very different, right? However, I mean, I was here as well when the volcano erupted, and sure, there's measures that have to be taken. However, that core anxiety that I'm familiar with in the cultures that I grew up in and lived in, I it's just not the same here. So I'm also wondering, um, the ones of us that are seeking out these teachings, these practices, like we just don't have it in us innately. So yes, then we do need to do practices for it. The ones that were born into these peaceful nervous systems, like they don't have to practice it every day. So then to me, it also makes sense that then it might be more challenging for us, right? Because we, in a way, have to undo something first and practice something that to others is just a given.
Yeah. I mean,
Anything.
it used to crack me up when I first moved here to teach yoga, to run the yoga shala down south in Canggu in 2009. And I would come, on my scooter, like kind of late, kind of nervous to go teach class, and I would like trip up the stairs to the front office, and there would be the like 4 or 5 desk that front office employees, and they would just be smiling and laughing at me in a good-hearted way, but they're just like, "Hi, Miss Tara, you're here to teach the yoga." And every single time I knew they were more yogic than me. Like I was zipping up, having stress, like being late, running to class, like trying to think of what am I going to say. And they were just being there, smiling, and living in some semi samadhi state. And they must have laughed. I mean, not in a making fun way, but the Westerners, most of us, like, there is this, as you said, kind of like an inherited stress response to life that, uh, yeah, we have to remember how to be. And I do think that what you said is very apt. The continuity of family, community, ritual, um, support. I mean, the Balinese are very rich in their support systems. Like they're very, it does feel like what we've said, that kind of more of a continuum. I love here watching, the people smile and laugh with each other and, help, like you said, like the children feel like they can go very seamlessly from house to house inside of the village, that they all know each other, they're all supported and not alone, as also the generations of family. And yeah, it's a completely different um internal perspective, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to come back for a second to some of the practices that you mentioned of, coming into your spine, um, and obviously we'll share later how people can find your teachings and connect with you. I was wondering though, if you could expand on that a little bit more, like what you mean with, going into the mind of your kidneys, or like, is there any internal dialogue or anything that you guide yourself through? I could imagine, right, it is in the marketplace, quote unquote. Like you might be out and about and you're like, oof, I'm merging and blending with my anxiety right now. I'm gonna drop into my spine. What, if you're okay to sharing, like what happens inside of you when you attempt to do that?
Yeah. I mean, if you were to imagine something that's tactile, like if you were to say, oh, it helps me if I massage my hand, and you can physically touch one hand to the other, registering, which is, so there's kind of a sequence, which is visualization, um, feeling, and then action. So, or somatization or sensing. So sensing kind of has a cognitive piece to it. It's like if I were searching for my keys in the dark. I have to. I'm using my senses in order to look for. Once I have the keys in my hand, then then I can do whatever it is I need to do. So the process of embodied anatomy kind of follows that sequence. And I'll back up for just a moment, go back to the spine. But the first time I encountered this work, like around 2008, my friend Chloe, who was my gateway to body mind centering, and she was studying thoroughly in the program, and she said to me, you don't feel your spleen. And I was like, yeah, where's the spleen, and who even thinks about the spleen? and, and from she wouldn't give me anything, because which is also part of body mind centering. Like she would just say, well, it's a really good inquiry for you to hold. And so the way I went about looking for that was looking in anatomy books. I would poke around. I would try really hard with my brain. Kind of like as a kid, you might try to like turn out the lights with your mind, but nothing would happen. And then one day, which was probably about 10 days after the initial inquiry, it just started to spark and come online. I mean, that's the term I use, that it comes online, which felt, which feels like, and I think you're feeling yours now, like it feels like a, you know, kind of like a bubbly, the spleen for me feels like a, like a bubbly uh, cushion of support in the left side of the body. And so to come into the spine, it's a similar process. After spending, I mean, for me, having spent, I don't know, many hundreds or thousands of hours in that same sequence of visualizing it, perhaps looking at skeletons, looking at anatomy books, having the um, having visualized inside, and then landing there. So actually feeling it, and then knowing, I mean, some cues that had been offered to me is that like you can lean into your vertebral column like a cat rubbing on a post. So that that gives a centralizing or a midline perspective, as well as recognizing, right, that this anatomy is already there, and now we're allowing our awareness to swim inside of ourselves and to recognize it can travel anywhere we ask it to. So, one question I'll hear people ask Bonnie Bainbridge a lot is, well, how do I feel that? And she'll say, well, darling, just ask. And so it's the permission to ask yourself to kind of crawl inside of your body mind and to unknow what you think it is, how you think it is. Because I think many of us, or I'll just say for myself, I used to I'd look into the mirror and say, okay, that's me. When I was in asana at the early days of yoga, what I loved about it is that I would feel me with not a with only the specificity that was offered within the context of that asana class. So the little pieces I would know were, okay, move my bones this way, or move my leg this way, my hands this way, hug this. There was a lot of a muscle and bone cue, and every once in a while the odd organ in a very generalized manner. um, and on asara we had this cue, inflate the kidneys, which always cracked me up because I never understood what it meant, even though I would use the cue. It's not a very good cue, but you can start to hover your awareness around where the band of the kidneys exists, and with a very soft inner gaze. So it kind of allows the cognitive aspect of ourselves to dial down. And then when the feeling sensation arises, as it is in you now, then you know it. You're there. Like, it's as if you're holding it in your hands.
Mhm.
And it's not that you have to, once you have that awareness, like squeeze it, hammer it, hold it tightly. You can sort of let it go, and but it informs you,
Mhm.
and you can feel, maybe the people who are listening can also start to feel, because one thing that a silver lining of the pandemic is that through Zoom we've been able to confirm that we can perceive across time and space through the screen, and also confirm, right? I can confirm that you feel that sensation, and I can feel that you feel that sensation, even though we're across time and space, which is another, to me, almost tangible sensation that we're not separate,
Yeah.
because we can do that. Like ants
Yeah.
can do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, even though we're not in the same room.
No.
I'm curious, in your own understanding, as you feel into the different organs and parts of the body, do you notice like different emotional qualities, energetic qualities? Like, do you reverse it as well? Like, specifically, like from my understanding, the liver is known to hold anger. Like, is that something that you play with as well?
I play with it. I like to forego. So, like the Chinese medical model, I love to play with the channels, and I'm working with an acupuncturist to kind of create a 6-layer theory, alternate style of yin that's coming forward.
Mm.
However, I might kind of dab that information in, but I'm not sure if the liver is holding anger, or if my stomach is holding anger,
Mm.
or something else. So more the inquiry, I would say, is how does that feel to you?
Yeah.
I, how do you experience that?
Mhm.
And what I one thing I think of a lot is coming from a film background, like, you know, old films used to have a single camera. So there'd be like one point of view, whereas a modern innovation in the film The Matrix was to have a whole circle of
Mhm.
cameras. And from the circle of cameras, you could take a figure up and turn it around in space and time. And so when we're in laboratories together, and let's say we're all feeling into our kidneys, I love to hear from the collective, because somebody is going to have a very acute sensation of their kidneys, and it might have colors, it might have sound, it might have directionality. Somebody else might have a very faint idea, but the one, one can teach the other. And I think it continues to unfold, so I love to look at all the different background about our organs, like, okay, the ancient Greeks had the humors, and um, different, there's, the chakra system from India, and there's different chakra systems. So I love to read like what different cultures or science, or even different eras of science, felt about the body, but then to also inquire, is that true for me? Is that how I
Mhm.
experience it?
Mhm. Yeah. I love how that speaks to the multiplicity as well that we spoke to earlier of, yes, we are connected, right? Like you're sensing me, feeling my liver, and it is such a unique way of what that feels like to me. And as I share with you, you're like, and you have that openness because you feel our connection, then you're like, whoa, because to me it feels so different. And that, yeah, that interconnecting of hearing each other, I just feel as you're speaking to the polarization that exists right now, I feel if there's more conversations like that, of like, what does it feel like to you? What does it feel like to you? Oh, okay, how interesting. Huh, I had no idea. There could be so much healing in that.
So much healing, because it's whatever someone believes is 100% true for them.
Mhm.
And
Exactly.
so
Yeah.
there's no objective in the sky, this is the right answer, this is the right thing to do, like this is the way it is. Like, we don't even know what we don't know.
I know.
So to stay open and curious is, such a wonderful way for us to receive each other, and to see. I mean, I love to read about the dialogues between people historically that sparked innovation. And, you know as you know, like in the world of psychology, it's because Jung had a deviation from Freud, or because others subsequently had deviations from the ones that came before. So we don't want to eliminate the difference, it's what sparks the innovation. But
Hmm.
can we develop the tolerance to receive one another in our
Hmm.
differences? It's hard. And I think, the media definitely exacerbates the differences, so that we get so charged up.
Yeah,
It's
for sure. Yeah. And they're like getting pulled out rather than kind of settling in and trusting and knowing that whatever is our experience is okay and it's
yeah.
validated. Yeah. Mm, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it makes me feel into like, as my creations, one studying into the field of somatic coaching, somatic therapy, and really like honoring the body and that. And then, the jewelry creations I create are so, I mean, I really make them more for myself of having these reminders that I need in any particular day. Like I've been feeling really connected to Kuan Yin, who in a way, like, she rides the dragon, and when I feel her, she says my love is powerful. I rest into my spine. Like it's these little symbols. And I know as part of this little conversation we sent you to the store to pick a few pieces, and I'd love it
Yeah.
if you could speak a little bit to just, yeah, what they mean to you, what you picked, any words that you do have.
I know, first of all, I love the pieces that I picked. I picked two necklaces, and they were, just one that I'm wearing is I follow my inner truth. And I think it's so much like what we've been speaking to. I mean, what's pictured on it is a beautiful mountainscape with a full moon over it. And um, I think having a talisman on, I mean, first of all, I've watched you, like, the intentionality with which you create, and I'm a big believer that, all the sequence of things that are created holds a vibration and a frequency that comes with. So, when I select jewelry, the intentionality, the the meaning, the care that's put into it, and I see that in all of your pieces. Like, it's impossible to go into your store and say select something. Are you serious? That's like going into the universe and say pick a star. Like, which star do you prefer? I don't know. They're so, all of them are, I mean, all of them have such depth and significance. I can imagine the amount of energy that you pour into the creations, into the sweetness of them. And I am struck, particularly in this day and age, being a woman that travels around the world, that this possibility, I think we've talked about this before, it's never been possible, maybe in the last 100 years, but not to the extent that we can, not with the choices that are afforded to us. And I feel somehow like this tremendous urge to pursue inner truth, inner wisdom, in a way that perhaps I don't know, like, if my ancestors were able to, or to the extent that they were able to, but for sure we have similar missions, you and I, which is to realize that truth, to actualize it, to create it, to potentiate it in others. And that is incredibly exciting. I feel, and I was thinking about this in the last couple of days. Like, you mentioned Kuan Yin, we went to Goagiri Putri in Nusa Penida, that mother temple, and the last station is Kuan Yin. And I was just thinking, going through, Ganesh, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, then Kuan Yin, like this sequence, how this continuum of DNA that is passed down and passed down and passed down and passed down for millions and millions and millions of years, until it ends up in this vessel that is me, and the vessel that is you, that it's encoded in the spiralic DNA are all the truths of our ancestors. And it's almost like, and I feel their packed desire, like their desires, if it was to move country or to migrate or to preserve or to perform or to whatever it was, that, then we're manifest out of that. And what else to do but live this truth, as
Yes. Yeah.
difficult as it may be to realize, but
Yeah.
100% what we're here to
Yeah.
do.
It makes me think of a really, really, and it's quite personal, but of a really powerful meditation I had once, and I felt I felt my mom and her mother really closely in my field, and a part of me just wanted to melt with them. They're both not in their bodies anymore, and I was like, oh, I want to be with you. And they came through with such fierceness, and they were like, you're the one of us with a body right now, and we gave you that body, so
Yeah.
go and to live in it, as boldly and as much in your truth as you can, because you're the one of us with a body right now. And that just, it kind of changed my life, that experience with them. I'm like, oh yeah, do not take this lightly. And for many of us, especially female bodied, we live in an environment where we're so harsh in our bodies. And I feel this entire conversation, there's so much magic in there. There's so much, like, so much of a tool of being here more, experiencing more joy, more pleasure, more everything. And so why not fully do it, despite the chaos of it at times, right? And the challenge.
They dance in your blood. They
Mm-hmm.
live in your veins. And I really hear you. I had a similar experience that was facilitated by one of my mentors, wherein my my mom's mom, my grandmother, who died in childbirth with my mom, so I never met her. And she came into this session so profoundly, so clearly, so intensely. And I feel like, and this was maybe 6 or 7 years ago, but she's been walking with me ever since. And there were so many strange coincidences. I was in Germany at the time and I couldn't figure out why there. Like, why is this the place that my grandmother is appearing? And then I found out later that she was, even though she was American, she was fluent in German. And I don't know what, like, I don't know why that, why then, why those circumstances, but it feels like the privilege to be able to walk places that she didn't get to walk, to move in ways that she probably didn't move, to see and taste and touch and interface,
Yeah.
and even to cycle back and get to be with my mother in a
Mm.
way that she couldn't after her birth. All of those things felt
Oh,
like part of the continuum.
yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
how beautiful. Thank you so, so, so much. What a yummy
Thank you. What a
conversation.
pleasure. What a joy.
I know. When I asked you what projects you're excited about right now, you said, I'm mostly excited about the fact that when we come into our body, all resources are available, which I love. I love that response. And for anyone out there who would like to study with you, be connected, take one of your classes, how can they do that?
This year in particular, because I put a kind of a hiatus on advanced trainings during COVID. So I'm really excited to be returning to in-person events, and I have a bunch of immersions and trainings coming up, and they can find all that information on tarajudelle.com. That's my website, or embodiedflow.com. And I have online classes at the moment on Yoga Glow. Um, and I have some audio recordings, or specifically ones about coming into the body and coming into the self, also on my website.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll put all the links into the show notes. People can just click on
Wonderful.
them. Thank you so much, Tara. Oh,
Thank you. So good to chat with you. So, so good.